This is St Mary's Abbey in the heart of York city centre. Look at these broken arches. Can you believe that once upon a time they soared higher than a modern 10-storey block? Inside, 100 souls were busy feeding the poor, schooling the local kids and praying every 3 hours with dogmatic devotion. 4 short years later, by 1540, this whole place was a roofless, windowless shell. The monks had all been pensioned off. Most got as little as 6 shillings a year, enough for 20 to 70 loaves if you weren't picky and the harvest didn't rot in the fields. So, top end, 70 loaves of bread to live on for a year. And if the monks resisted, well, those people had a nasty habit of getting a bad case at the deads. And while the monks were being shuffled out the back door, the king's auditors were coming in through the front one, taking every plate, every chalice, every cup, and then melting them down. Silver and gold were best if they could find them, but if they couldn't, it really didn't matter. Just as William the Conqueror counted every pig 4.5 centuries earlier, Henry VIII counted every pewter spoon. Historian David Knowles says Henry wiped 863 monasteries off the map in a single decade. So why did he do it? The answer is because he was broke and he wanted the church's money. But it also meant that he took food off the table of the poor, and the poor don't starve quietly. Most people know that Henry wanted a divorce. His quest for a male heir and the beheading of Anne Boleyn are pretty famous. But what most people don't realise is that what he truly craved was a bank balance big enough to be able to go and fight France whenever the mood took him. And trust me, the mood took him quite often. The problem was that the crown was perpetually broke. The solution? Well, it was staring him in the face the entire time. Go after the one institution in the country that was still richer than the king. Go after the church. Think about it, the monasteries alone owned around a quarter of all cultivated land in England. In 1535, the king's own survey, the Valor Ecclesiasticus, put the church's annual income at £160,000. That was roughly 3 times the annual income from Henry's royal estates. Now you can begin to see why he looked at the church with such envious eyes. Once Henry pushed through the Act of Supremacy in 1534, that made him the head of the Church of England. At that point, nobody could legally stop him. All he needed was an excuse. And Thomas Cromwell was the man to go and get it for him. And so our man Thomas Cromwell enters the stage. A commoner, a sharp-witted lawyer, a political fixer par excellence, and a fan of the eminently fashionable but silly-looking hats at the time. If you're wondering, he was Oliver Cromwell's great-great-granduncle. Different Cromwell, but same family fetish for heads on spikes. Back to Henry. Henry liked Thomas Cromwell, and so he gave him a brand new fancy-pants title, Vicar General. That was the first time the position had ever been created in England. In 1536, he gave him a rather ominous set of instructions. Go and examine every single monastery in England. Cromwell's commissioners fanned out across the nation, armed with a long list. They were looking at financial records and also for relics, but most importantly, they wanted juicy rumours of naughty monks. Dirt that could be used later. Did the abbot keep a mistress in the hayloft, or the cellar monks sell off the communion wine to smugglers? Things that could be used to justify confiscation. The reports were a fascinating mix. Obviously, there was a kernel of truth to some of this, as some houses were a bit lax. But Cromwell blew minor issues into absolute hysteria. Parliament swallowed his carefully tabloid journalism whole. So, in 1536, the first Suppression Act was passed. Every monastery worth less than £200 a year was closed. That's about 400 of them, just like that. The larger houses? Oh, they were promised immunity, at least for now. That was a false sense of security, though. The smaller closures paid Henry dividends immediately. It was an absolute smash and grab. Lead was stripped from the roofs, bells that had called people to prayer for centuries were melted down to make cannons. Jewels were pawned off, and livestock, the very basis of many monastic economies, was flogged off at local markets. All that cash flowed straight into the royal coffers. As for the land, well, that was either kept by the crown or sold off at bargain basement prices to courtiers and merchants buying loyalty. These new landowners, beneficiaries of the king's actions, would then be sure to vote the right way in Parliament and ensure Henry's continued power. But ordinary folk, the everyday people of England, well, they also felt the blow almost immediately too. They weren't just places of worship, they were community hubs. They doled out food every morning to the poor, they ran the hospitals, they maintained vital bridges, and even paid for pageants and festivals to keep local trade kicking over. When that safety net vanished overnight, unemployment and vagrancy surged. And that was the perfect kindling for a rebellion. Nowhere in the country did the smouldering embers of resentment glow hotter than here in the north. 55 miles southeast of here is Louth. In October 1536, a crowd leaving Sunday Mass heard a terrifying rumour. The King's Commissioners were coming for their parish church plate as well. That was the last straw. Within days, 30,000 men were marching, but not under royal banners, under their own. The banner carried an image that is meaningless to most people today. It's called the 5 Wounds of Christ. The flow of blood and water from Christ's side wound is seen as a symbol for the birth of the Church and its sacraments, which offer salvation and purification from sin. This in a time when the king was placing himself above the Church and executing people in order to do it. So you can see why he had regarded as a challenge to the authority that he claimed. These rebels called themselves the Pilgrimage of Grace, and their demands were clear. They wanted the monasteries reopened, the king's evil councillors, meaning Cromwell of course, removed, and a parliament held north of the River Trent, far away from London's influence. Henry, ever the cunning politician, stalled for time. He promised pardons, he invited the leaders to talks, he even allowed a royal duke to hear their grievances at Doncaster. But while negotiations dragged on through the bitter winter months, the king quietly and deliberately shipped artillery north. By spring, the Pilgrims' resolve had weakened owing to an extremely harsh winter and too much disillusionment because of broken promises. And that's when Henry struck. More than 150 ringleaders were rounded up and executed. A brutal message sent. The larger monasteries, the ones that had been promised immunity, the ones that had been protected, for now, they'd just lost their political value and any fig leaf of protection. So now they lost their roof lead as well. Let's take St Mary's in York as a prime example, a really vivid illustration of this process. Founded way back in 1055, then rebuilt in the 1270s, it truly rivaled the mighty York Minster right next door. At its dissolution, it was a bustling place, housing roughly 50 monks, 40 servants, and even running a school for the city boys. Its estate sprawled across 3 counties, netting it an astonishing amount of money each year. On the 29th of November 1539, the abbot, a man named William Thornton, signed the deed of surrender. It must have been a truly heartbreaking moment. The monks, they got a shilling each for breakfast, a modest pension of £4 to £8 a year, and the rather brutal order to vacate within 24 hours or else. Locals watch, I can only imagine, stunned as carts trundled away laden with illuminated psalters, precious chalices, and even the great kitchen cauldrons. Within weeks, the workmen arrived, levering the stained glass windows out with iron bars. The lead was torched off the roof. Just imagine the smell of all that acrid, melting and burning metal filling the air. The metal was then hauled away to the royal foundries. By 1545, the choir, once a place of soaring hymns, was open to the sky. The abbot's lodging became a private mansion for a favoured councillor, and this great church, once the spiritual heart of northern England, a beacon of learning and charity, was literally quarried for its stone to patch the city walls. Imagine that destruction, the sheer scale of it. Numbers, you see, only tell half the story. The human cost here was immense, and it's something we often gloss over. Ex-monks suddenly cast out faced truly grim choices. Some managed to scrape by on those meagre pensions, which, by the way, shrank considerably with inflation over the next few years. By 1550, some estimates say that they were worth half their original value relative to bread. Others tried to take up parish posts, but with so many people losing their jobs, in want of a better way to describe an out-of-work monk, that meant there was a large oversupply of people whose main CV skill set read prayers and chanting. If you think the monks had it bad, consider the situation for the nuns. Unmarried women had very limited options. They were largely banned from most secular work. A heartbreaking study of Yorkshire convents, for instance, shows that over half the ex-religious women died in abject poverty within 15 years of their expulsion. And it wasn't just the religious. Lay brothers, millers, brewers, shepherds, masons, steeplejags, anyone who worked for the monasteries suddenly had no or vastly fewer employment options. Charitable alms, the very lifeline for the most vulnerable, simply dried up. The poor rate levied by parishes to try and cope absolutely rocketed. In York alone, the city records paint a particularly stark picture. A 300% increase in the poor rate between 1536 and 1544 alone. Contemporary visitors reported truly distressing scenes, describing bedridden folk crying out for milk and bread in places where, only a few years prior, the Abbey gatehouse had faithfully fed them every single day. It was an absolute social catastrophe. Numbers, you see, only tell half the story. There's a human cost to focus on, and historians often overlook that. After the Pilgrimage of Grace collapsed so brutally, even the great Abbey at Glastonbury, one of the wealthiest and most revered in the land, tried to ride out the storm. Its abbot, Richard Whiting, a man in his 80s, bravely refused to hand over the deeds when Cromwell's commissioners came knocking. Bad move, as it turned out. They conveniently found a rusty pilgrimage banner in his wardrobe and promptly accused him of sedition. Treason against the king. And this was a king who'd never met a problem that he couldn't solve with a swift beheading. Whiting was not so lucky as to face an executioner's axe. For him, things were about to get considerably worse. On November 1539, the octogenarian abbot was dragged onto a hurdle, a crude cart, to the very top of Glastonbury Tor. There, in a horrifying display of royal power, he was hanged, drawn and quartered. Then his head was struck off and mounted on the Abbey gates. Well, that certainly sent a message, and it was one that no prelate, no abbot, no bishop, no one could possibly misread. Surrender quietly, hand over all of your lands and all of your wealth, or join him. Henry wasn't messing about. Within 18 months, every single monastery from Canterbury in the south to Carlisle in the north had capitulated. The total haul was absolutely staggering. More than 800 monasteries, over 90,000 acres of land, and then enough gold and silver bullion to fund 4 continual years of war with France. Now, think about this. That was just what Henry kept for himself. He took vastly more than that, and then he just gave it away. This was an incredibly smart move on Henry's part. This clientelism secured an elite in every region of the country that owed its wealth and its power solely to him. By 1545, if you rode through the English countryside, you would have found it almost unrecognisable. Those towering abbeys, which had dominated skylines for centuries, standing as symbols of faith and power, they now stood roofless, their great walls glowing white, stark and ghostly among the fields. Locals, ever pragmatic, scavenged the stones for their own cottages. Abbey churches, once sacred spaces, became humble barns, and cloisters, designed for quiet contemplation, morphed into sheep pens. This wasn't just physical destruction, it was a complete transformation of the landscape, both literally and figuratively. The landed families, those courtiers and merchants who had been enriched by the monastic estates, now formed a powerful new political bloc, fiercely loyal to the Tudor dynasty. Parliament, packed with those very beneficiaries, rubber-stamped every single royal whim. The English Reformation, which had been hesitant, deeply political and piecemeal in its early stages, was now utterly irreversible. And that welfare system we talked about, the one provided by the monasteries, that was replaced by the patchy, underfunded poor law, a system that in various forms lasted all the way through until the 19th century. If you've been enjoying this story so far, then do consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and also tell your friends about the channel. So the next time you happen to see a ruin like St Mary's or any of these magnificent broken structures scattered across Britain, remember it's not just a picturesque pile of stones, a quaint bit of history for a postcard. No, it's the tangible residue of a truly monumental smash and grab. It was an event that redrew the entire map of power, of money and of belief in England. Henry got his cash, Cromwell got his revolution, and England got a social upheaval, a violent wrenching of its very fabric that it never truly reversed. The monasteries never came back, their chantry stayed silent, their vast libraries scattered to the winds, their almonries, once bustling with charity, remained empty. The dissolution wasn't simply a religious tweak, a minor adjustment to the national faith. No, it was a moment, it was the definitive moment when the Middle Ages truly ended, brought down with a royal wrecking ball. St Mary's Abbey in York and the dissolution of the monasteries, a truly demolishing little piece of the past.